Oh, you know that girl I was corresponding with?
Oh, yes, about the cultural subjects.
Yeah. Well, after a while, we got on the subject of love. Naturally, on a very cultural level.
Well, what else can you do in a letter?
Welcome to Season 5 of How Would Lubitsch Do It, a podcast in which we discuss the works of director Ernst Lubitsch, one film at a time. It's 1940, and Kevin Bahr joins us to discuss The Shop Around the Corner. Come visit ernstcast.com if you'd like show notes, resources as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing, a link to our Discord, or just to say hi. Welcome back, everyone. We are here with Kevin Bahr to discuss everyone's favorite Christmas movie starring Jimmy Stewart. I'm sure you know the one. Kevin, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And what provoked you to hop on our podcast about Ernst Lubitsch?
Well, my name is Kevin Bahr. I'm a film historian, scholar, and a screenplay writer primarily. I divide my time and what I watch a lot between old Hollywood in the studio era and a lot of down and dirty like exploitation cinema, the dregs, the trash cinema circles. And what I write about most frequently are the exploitation films like Doris Wishman, Herschel Gordon Lewis, Roger Corman, and the whole canon of Something Weird video titles. But when I feel, bored or sad or lonely, I always end up returning to old Hollywood films because I grew up on films like the Marx Brothers and the Three Stooges. My parents weren't movie buffs, but they always had some of those tapes of old black and white movies. So everyone has a Mount Rushmore of directors whose style and personality and everything they put in their movies speaks so clearly to you. And out of line, I think it would be Agnes Varda, Samuel Fuller, John Cassavetes, and Ernst Lubitsch. Those are my four filmmakers. So I feel like you can color in pretty much everything else that I like about movies using those four. And I first got into Lubitsch when I was in late high school, early college. I genuinely don't remember which one I watched first. It was either Trouble in Paradise or Shop Around the Corner. But whatever it was, I saw them both in pretty close succession right as I began studying film in my freshman year of college. And at first, I just thought they were hilarious, these really charming films. But it wasn't until I started to dive deeper into film studies that I learned just how incredible and unique his style was, how everything was subtle and succinct and quietly brilliant, a way of approaching relatively familiar stories or things that feel like fairy tales. And most importantly, it seemed like every great director that I started to fall in love with worshipped him. So I kept going back to this well of everyone wants to be like Lubitsch. I'm curious as to why that is. But I think what drew me to his work the most was two elements that you don't hear talked about as much when you talk about Lubitsch. One is this idea of laughing through the tears, which I think I might be plagiarizing from Joseph McBride, where it's not just about comedy. It's often laughter and pain commingle, just like they do in real life. It creates a lot of beautiful, bittersweet moments in his work. And the second thing that attracted me to him is that his films essentially have no antagonists a lot of the time. He approaches nearly all his characters with an open heart. And I find that to be much more rewarding than a director who thinks human morality can only be black and white.
This film in particular, Shop Around the Corner, seems to be one that speaks on kind of an elemental level to a lot of people. I was introduced to it, I believe, at a point when I was getting to know Lubitsch a little more. I was also going through a phase of really wanting to dig more into Jimmy Stewart's career. So I went, oh, hey, it's a film that has both the people I'm interested in. Why not watch it? And immediately after watching it, I realized that this was not a run-of-the-mill film. This was a truly special film. So I'm curious about where you arrive at this. What makes Shop Around the Corner so singular for you?
There's so many different things to talk about. There's no one great place to start, but I think it's the idea that when people talk about it, it's broken down to the romantic comedy plot of these people hate each other in real life, but they don't realize they're secretly pen pals and falling in love with each other. But more than any other thing that's used that story in the past 100 years, Ernst Lubitsch makes it just as much about the shop and the people within Matacek and Company that really elevate it to something like, it feels like a story that's been there forever. And it's like you feel these characters, they feel so real and lifelike compared to so many other archetypes and cartoony figures in Lubitsch's filmography. They feel like people you could know at a shop around the corner from wherever you are, not just Hungary or Budapest, but any shop around the corners throughout the entire world. And I think it's that universality in the characters and the fact that the comedy and drama in this film is so intermingled that it really elevates it to something special. Plus, the fact that it has a beautiful scene at Christmas by the end, which we'll talk about later. You make a Christmas movie, especially a good Christmas movie, and your legacy is secure forever. Mm-hmm. Well, it's something that people need an excuse to watch every year. And for me, I don't know about you, but for me, every year I do try to watch Shop Around the Corner just because nothing puts me in the Christmas spirit quite like the ending to this film.
I think that the two films I tend to turn most to every year are this and the very, very happy film, McCabe and Mrs. Miller.
I mean, honestly, like beyond Shop Around the Corner, most of my Christmas watching is like the Mystery Science Theater episodes of Santa Claus Conquers the Martians or things like that.
When I was, I think, 14 or 15 for a few years there, my go-to Christmas watch was episode 6 of the TV show Band of Brothers, which is about a horrific siege. Eventually, I'll have purely happy Christmas movies to watch.
Did that siege take place at Christmas? I've never seen Band of Brothers.
It all takes place at Christmas. There's beautiful snow everywhere, shot in a nice soundstage.
Christmas is what you make of it. I think watch whatever puts you in the right spirit.
Exactly. Sometimes Christmas is watching Julie Christie drown her sorrows in an opium den in the middle of nowhere in the Canadian wilderness. I've been reading James Harvey's History of Romantic Comedies book. He describes the arc of Shop Around the Corner as the characters trying to achieve benevolence. The idea of achieving benevolence, I think, is really telling because what it really means is the characters are flawed. The way they come into the film might not be benevolent, especially when it comes to Mr. Moderchek, Kralik, and Clara. And throughout the film, they, through various means and pathways, become better people. Which, might describe a lot of character arcs, but this is a rare film where it's directly, I think, about that. It's not so much about Clara and Kralik getting together at the end. It's that their getting together can only occur by them essentially getting over themselves and figuring out how they can arrange their lives and their identities so they can become maybe not the best versions of themselves, but good versions of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny how often when they're talking about the letters and the correspondence throughout, I don't know how true this is for Clara, but definitely for Kralik, his obsession with being worried about what's going to happen when she meets him and finds out he isn't the perfect guy that he's come off as in the letters. I think the same is somewhat true for Clara. She's trying to come off as this high intellect and great mind when she's in the same position as Kralik. And that's part of why so much of the film is, at least the second half of the film, is built around him destroying the image of the perfect man that he was the one to build up in the first place.
The thing about Shop Around the Corner, I think, that becomes more and more clear as you watch it is that its popular reputation nowadays, especially, is, I think, in some ways at least tied to the Nora Ephron romantic comedy You've Got Mail. And I think that film, as much as it's easy to dunk on that in comparison to Shop Around the Corner, I think it's a useful reflection of the film in trying to figure out what the hell Shop Around the Corner is. The thing about Shop Around the Corner is that I think maybe even the majority of people who've watched in the past 20 years have arrived at it as, oh, it's the film that You've Got Mail. It's a remake of, which I think is terribly misleading because You've Got Mail is a remake of one of the main plot threads of this film, but it is not a remake of Shop Around the Corner because the Shop Around the Corner is not the story of how two pen pals who despise each other in real life fall in love. It is the story of Moderchek and Company. Like the title card says, it is not the story of Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan or Clara and Kralik. Their story is part of a wider ensemble piece. It is a true ensemble film where Mr. Moderchek is just as important of a character to the film as Clara and Kralik. And one could even argue Purovich is nearly as important. It is a very democratic film in that way.
Absolutely. I don't know if you've ever seen the trailer for Shop Around the Corner. It might be the only time I've seen, and I've tried digging, that Lubitsch was ever caught on film speaking. We have like the radio plays.
Yeah, the Screen Guild Playhouse, yeah.
But I think that one line he has in the Shop Around the Corner trailer when Frank Morgan says, hopefully he gives you a Morgan who makes you laugh in the Shop Around the Corner. And Lubitsch says, I hope.
Yeah, there's very little footage of him speaking English, at least, into a camera. He's doing the Hitchcock thing, the thing that everyone says Hitchcock did first before Hitchcock.
Exactly. I mean, his name, when you watch the trailer for Shop Around the Corner, his name is all over it. It's not promoting it as the next great romantic comedy starring James Stewart and Margaret Sullivan, who were like an act together. You know, people recognize the both of them from at least The Shopworn Angel. But in the trailer, they're not necessarily focusing on them. They're focusing on all the individual characters of the shop and how it's a story of a shop. I don't believe they even tell you about the main plot device going on here where, oh, they're pen pals who love each other, but they hate each other in real life. And I completely agree that You've Got Mail is just a remake of one strand. It's not a remake of the whole Shop Around the Corner, because to understand the Shop Around the Corner without a Matichek figure is to just not understand the Shop Around the Corner.
It's impossible to tell the story of this film without kind of rewinding to before Ninotchka, because this film is, for those of us who listened to the Ninotchka episode, the second of a two-part deal he made with MGM. Ninotchka was his one for them. That was the project that was foisted upon him so that he would be given the resources significantly smaller. This is a way lower budget film than Ninotchka, but he was given the resources to make Shop Around the Corner. Moreover, this film started as an independent production before Ninotchka, with the Ernst Lubitsch Productions Incorporated company.
Myron Selznick, right? That was who he was involved with?
Exactly. And this is in a period when he is just trying so hard to break away from the studio system to become independent. I mean, That and Certain Feeling and To Be or Not to Be are two more results of that. But he kept finding himself just having to go back into the arms of the studios. He was canny even when he was compromising. He still ensured that he retained a certain degree of creative control over the films, and he certainly had full creative control over this one. This film ended up landing at MGM. It was the film that he got to make after Ninotchka made quite a bit of money. Spoiler alert, this film ends up cleaning out. It actually makes significantly more than Ninotchka on a much smaller budget.
Can you imagine if Lubitsch had lived to see the downfall of the studio system?
If he was virile enough in the 60s to have struck out independently, that would have been great, at the age of like 75?
Obviously, the way he lived for 20, 30 years was going to catch up with him at some point, but I always wonder what could have happened as not only like the films became more allowed to show more stuff, but especially just because he seemed to want to be independent so badly ever since the running Paramount thing didn't work out for him. I almost wish that he could have seen the rise of the producer unit structure in the 1950s.
This conversation comes up quite a bit, especially later in the show. When we're nearing the end of Lubitsch's life, he'll be gone by 1947, and it's 1940 now in the podcast. And this question of what could have been had Lubitsch survived longer really haunts us. I should also say a word about the writing process of this film, where this is another Raphaelson joint, although he is not the only credited screenwriter. But by all accounts, Sam Raphaelson was the primary writer on this film. Him and Lubitsch undertook their usual process of kibitzing to write the script. But one interesting thing, I think, this film in particular is that the actual play that it's based off of, Parfumerie, he and Raphaelson stuck just a little bit closer to the scenario than they usually would. Most of their collaborations, and Lubitsch in general, he would take the high concept, like the elevator pitch, and essentially adapt that, and they would be completely irreverent. But it seems like something in the source material spoke to Lubitsch a little bit more than usual with this film. And you can tell that this film meant a lot to him. I think of all the films he made in his life, this is one of the ones he held most dear and spent the most time shepherding in. There's a few others that we can point to, but I think this might, Raphaelson at least sees it as the height of his collaboration with Lubitsch.
In my opinion, probably the single best script construction out of anything they did. It's not even just in terms of the comedy. He made funnier films. This film, the script in it just has such humanity for all of its characters and truly seems to want to understand everybody, with possibly the exception of Vadish. But I think it all traces back to the fact that Lubitsch was the son of a tailor, pretty much. And he had Simon Lubitsch, he had his shop, and there was a lot of pressure on Ernst to take the shop over and to sort of run things from there, but he had no interest. I think he worked 2 days and then just did not want to be involved in this family business ever at all. But he grew up in that milieu, and you can try and escape the things that raised you, but eventually you're going to feel something for them. And I think not only is this one of the few films he ever made about working class people and people who just work day to day and just get by on what they can. But there's such a fondness for them. There's such a fondness for the people who have to just make their daily bread, just go to work, do their job in the little shops, and then go home. And they can't even afford a living room per se. And it's so funny how so many of his comedies deal with wealthy people or people who try to get wealthy, you know, the nouveau riche and all that. But in the opening of this film, as the shop is opening up and all the employees are waiting outside, waiting for the boss to arrive, most of their conversations are about money. Flora talks to Pirovich about the doctor, and he says he hired Dr. Hagedish, and Flora says, oh, well, he's an expensive doctor. And Pirovich says, yes, I know, but, you know, I want to make sure the boy's okay. Then Ilona comes up. She's wearing a silver fox that they comment on. And then they comment on like, oh, it must have cost you quite a bit. So almost right away, subconsciously, he's telling you where these characters are in social ladder and how when they're thinking of things such as doctors or what to wear, they also have to think about how much money they're spending on it, which is very rare for Lubitsch.
It is interesting. I think there are antecedents in his career for this where I really felt a turn happened around 1932. When, if you look at all of his talkies, at least, if we just limit ourselves to our talkies, because he also made a few, I think, very clash-conscious silent films, like Three Women is, I think we joked during that episode that you could call it Love and Capital. That movie, although that film is exclusively about high society, but it's about people with a bit of financial anxiety in high society and the way that, you know, relationships are transactional in that context. But something like Trouble in Paradise, I think, is conscious of, for example, the way that Gaston and Lily are very working class, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
they're basically, interestingly enough, kind of portrayed as a very domestic married couple, even though they're legendary crooks. And then they're set into contrast against this absolutely opulently rich Madame Collet. And then you have something like Design for Living, where you have characters who start as these bohemians, but completely impoverished bohemians. And by the end of the film, they're rich through sheer force of the matron of the arts.
The creativity, yeah, the sheer creativity that she gives them.
Yeah, the creativity generated by their forbidden romantic three-way tension, right? Shop feels different, doesn't it, right? Because it's about a whole bunch of people who, there's none of that fantasy, that American dream fantasy, even though Design for Living set in France and in England, it's still an American dream movie. Those two get to fulfill the American dream, except in a different romantic arrangement. In this film, no one's living that dream. Everyone has their station. There's never a sense that there is some sort of poetic moment when one of them is going to make it rich. Jimmy Stewart's big victory is becoming manager of this very small department store. And eventually he might take over from Mr. Moderchek and become an upper middle class himself. That's all I can hope for. The film is palpably realist about that.
Absolutely. Because it's not that this is Lubitsch's most class-conscious film, which it might be. It's that so many of his other films that deal with working class people, whether it's the two crooks in Trouble in Paradise who promise that happy days are just around the corner when they find out they're trying to come up with their next scheme, or the bohemians in Design for Living who don't necessarily love their style. They would prefer to be bohemians and dirt poor than struggling for food than to enter into just any old office career. But they are still striving to be a part of that social set. And in Shop Around the Corner, there's no one really striving there. It's like you said, that Jimmy Stewart's big thing is he just wants to be a manager. And there's the great exchange between him and Pirovich. He asks him if he could live off his salary if he got married. And he says, well, how much would it cost for like a 2-bedroom apartment?
3 rooms? What do you need 3 rooms for? You live in the bedroom.
Where do you eat?
In the kitchen. You get a nice big kitchen.
Well, where do you entertain?
Entertain? What are you, an ambassador? Who do you want to entertain?
It never feels like the film is engaging in any sort of condescension. It was such a palpable thing, right? That in the post-Depression era, or even towards the end of the Depression in the U.S., Preston Sturges made a whole movie about this, right? About how you have these rich Hollywood types making miserablest films about the poor and how self-important and out of touch they actually are.
I want this to be a picture of dignity, a true canvas of the suffering of humanity.
But with a little sex in it.
With a little sex in it.
And one never gets the sense that Lubitsch is ever being condescending or even harboring any illusions, romanticizing these people's working class life that they have to deal with, right? There's just this matter-of-factness about the film that is incredibly unique.
Absolutely. Part of the reason that the characters are so endearing is that they don't necessarily bemoan their social status. And the only person who does try to escape from their status is just looked down upon as a snivelly social climber in the character of Vadish.
I can see by the expression on your underpaid faces that you wonder where I got all this money.
No, Mr. Vadash, I don't wonder.
What do you mean?
I just mean I don't wonder.
Who I wanted to get your opinion on, because if there's any antagonist in the film, it's definitely either him or Mrs. Matichek, who we never see. With just a couple small tweaks, he could be the classic Lubitsch rake or the dandy, someone who fools around with different women, and it's fun and it's funny and he's so charming that, you just let it go. But in this situation, he's looked down upon and everyone in the office hates him because he's flaunting all this wealth that he's gotten from sleeping with wealthier women.
In the same way that Adam Belinsky and Clooney Brown feels like Lubitsch almost apologizing for the way he portrays Seletsky in To Be or Not to Be. This turncoat, man of culture, university type writer, professor type in To Be or Not to Be, and he's the villain. He was actually a very common type around that era. That same type appears in Hitchcock films and other World War II era espionage films from that time, that turncoat professor. So Charles Boyer in Clooney Brown is a heroic version of this exact character. He is a professor who is fighting the Nazis and one of the most heroic characters I can think of. In the same way that feels like the sunny version of Seletsky, this character here, Bardish, feels like, the dark shadow of the Maurice Chevalier character. Maurice Chevalier is portrayed sleeping with the king's wife. He sleeps with everybody in every movie at all times, usually. And it is never treated as a serious thing. It's like, oh, everyone's a little mad, but, we'll work it out, and it all works out. And it's very funny and naughty. In this film, this is the only Lubitsch film I think I can think of that treats adultery as something not to be joked about. And so we get Vardash, who is this rake, who, despite, I think, not being fundamentally any different than the Chevalier character archetype, is in this context a villain because he is doing something that in the moral world of Shop Around the Corner, which is very distinct from the moral world of Design for Living or Trouble in Paradise or Merry Widow, Love Parade, etc., etc. The moral world is different, so the same actions result in different results. And I think, this feels like maybe the single biggest ethical turn of Lubitsch's career up to this point. I can't think of a single other instance where, like, even in Heaven Can Wait, we see the fallout of it. The adultery in Heaven Can Wait hurts. We move past it, and part of the point of Heaven Can Wait is we want to forgive that character, but it's still seen as a failing in some way because we focus on the Gene Tierney character's hurt about that.
I don't know how much you can pin this to the Hays Code, maybe, like trying to show more morality.
Let's look at To Be or Not to Be 2 years later. Do we think about the hurt of Jack Benny when Carol Lombard clearly sleeps with the young pilot Savinsky? No, we really want them to bone, at least I do, because it's impossible to take that great actor Joseph Tura seriously. Even 2 years from now, even that uncertain feeling where you have the least believable other man in Burgess Meredith. That affair doesn't seem to have the same weight as this,
I think that points to what you said about the film being one of the most realistic that he ever did, not just because of social class, but just because it actually does deal with real human emotions. And it is funny how you would have to make very few changes to make Frank Morgan's Matichek here into a character like the king from the Merry Widow, because he's very blustery, he's very outrageous, and there is a lot of mugging going on in the first half of Shop Around the Corner with Frank Morgan's character in his traditional like Wizard of Oz type role. And then the scene where the spy comes back, he comes back with the report saying like, you're right, your wife is having an affair, it's with one of your employees, it's with Vadish. And Frank Morgan's, all his mugging, all his big gestures and everything just drops completely. And there's not a hint of melodrama in his face in that scene, in his slow walk across the empty shop. And it has one of the most heartbreaking lines in the whole Lubitsch canon, where he says that he and his wife have been married for 22 years. I guess she just didn't want to grow old with me.
22 years I was proud of my wife. Well, she just didn't want to grow old with me.
He's very emblematic of the strategy in the character writing in this film, which is that they're all self-contradictory. They're all in a fight between their demons and the good elements of themselves, right? Like Matichek is, the first 40 minutes of the film, he's not a likable character in the least. because we only meet him in the state he's in, which is this tyrannical, slightly paranoid boss who has it out for no clear reason for Kralik. And we only find out in hindsight that this is a temporary state because he is riven with what he calls poison in his mind. He suspects someone in the store is sleeping with his wife.
He is tyrannical. He's also a little bit goofy, so we're not completely against him. If you can say this word in a way that doesn't imply like a windy day, he's very blustery. He's a little bit of a blowhard. He's yelling and screaming, but he's also just goofy about it. And it's clear that he doesn't quite know everything that he claims to be so knowledgeable in, like the whole argument with the Ochichonia box with Kralik about how you don't have to tell me it's imitation leather. I know it's imitation leather. There is a sense of lovability there that like...
in like a bumbling way, right? Like in a way that...
bumbling.
Yeah. And then slowly he's revealed as this deeply lonely man who just wants human connection. And when he is essentially apologizing to his staff, he says,
You're right. This is my home. This is where I spent most of my life.
and that line, his delivery of that, on paper, it seems like this very sweet sentiment, maybe, but as delivered in the film and is directed by Lubitsch, as you pointed out, it sounds desperately sad in some ways.
It's such a joyous scene where they're celebrating the biggest night they've had since Christmas 1928, before the Depression. And they're all very happy, and he's congratulating them for a job well done. And then he starts speaking from the heart about, apparently they send him a little Christmas tree off screen, and they send him a card. It's a very basic card, it sounds like. They just say they wish he's coming home soon. But just repeating that line sends him into this sort of a tailspin where he's like, you're right, this is my home, and this is where I spent most of my life. It is such a drastic turn away from the joyous mood of the rest of the scene, to the point where he literally has to stop himself and then says, well, it wouldn't be Christmas without a bonus. Am I right?
Yeah, one could say that psychologically he's mixed up, but personally he's fine, Morgan plays that so beautifully, right? Where I'm never quite sure. My interpretation seems to shift depending on my mood. Whether his reading of that line is him being overcome with emotion in the sense of his heart being full from those around him, or is he having to stop himself because he's thinking of the void outside. It's both.
I mean, clearly the scene afterwards has him literally going from person to person at the shop to find someone to spend Christmas Eve with, because he's not going to be with his wife anymore. It's implied that they're separated. They're not going to be together again.
He's trying to find new family,
Exactly. He said that, this probably is my home, this shop here, which means these people are my family. So what can I do to fill the void that's outside of the shop?
There is a slight I've wasted my life tinge, isn't there?
Exactly. And I think that anyone listening to this who hasn't seen the movie won't entirely know what we mean about the ambiguity unless you see it delivered, because it is a tonal shift that comes so far out of nowhere that also could be interpreted a number of different ways. Not just the scene before, but like the tonal shift. It leads to one of my favorite moments in all movie history, which is the final scene with Matichek, where he finally finds someone to spend Christmas Eve with. I could wax on about it, but I just think the shot outside of the shop with the snow falling, which I realized this time around, it has this incredible almost bokeh effect.
What they're doing is that they're doing a very good job of putting snow right next to the camera lens, so it's out of focus in the foreground. We see that less than things that are out of focus in the background cinema, and that combined with a very specific, you can tell they agonized over the texture of that snow. I'm guessing it's like soap shavings or something. The most perfectly done version of that I've ever seen. Ever since I first watched this movie, I was like, this is the best fake snow I've ever seen. It doesn't behave like snow. It behaves like feathers. It doesn't really pass as the way that snow falls, but it shouldn't. I mean, that first shot where you see Matichek elbowing his way through the crowd to get close to the store, coming in from the dark into the glowing of the store, and there's snow and it's landing on his shoulders. It's one of those magical... To me, it's the second of two major tonal turning points in the film that just destroy me. The first is Matichek's attempted suicide, which is then followed by a brutal scene between Clara and Kralik, the famous diner scene where their connection is missed in the most brutal possible way.
Are you deliberately trying to spoil my evening? Why do you want to do me harm? Why do you hate me so?
I don't hate you.
Oh, I suppose you love me.
Oh, why should I? What have you done to make me love you?
Well, I don't want you to love me.
I don't.
And then we go to this long denouement, and think about the shot and what the shot represents to me. It's a turning of the film from a film that might have had a conventional denouement to a film that is anything but, right? All of the conflicts in the film kind of slowly dissipate. At this point, the stakes are lower than they were 20 minutes ago in the film. And the stakes continually get lower and lower as you go. Everyone works out how to get through their conflicts in a more mature, benevolent way. For example, Mr. Moderchuk realizes something about himself that is both kind of completes him, but also he's mourning the void outside the store, for all the light that's in the store. By the time he gives that little speech, it's dark outside, there's no one there, and there's no one to go home to. It's this absurdly melancholy little stretch that I think, climaxes to me when Moderchuk is just scoping out everyone in the store one by one to keep him company that night. I'm always amazed that him kind of landing on Rudy should feel, I wince a little because it feels like 10% creepy, but it dodges it completely. I always think it's going to get like, oh, this maybe hasn't aged well, but it has. It's flawlessly executed. Lubitsch tap dances over whatever any problems anyone could have with that scene so beautifully. Anyways, I'll stop my rant now.
Rudy, do you like chicken noodle soup?
I certainly do, Mr. Moderchuk.
Yeah, and what would you think of roast goose stuffed with baked apples and fresh boiled potatoes and butter and some red cabbage on the side, huh?
I love it.
Yeah, and then some cucumber salad with sour cream.
Oh, Mr. Moderchuk.
And then a double order of apple strudel with vanilla sauce.
Sounds wonderful.
Yes, well, you're going to have it, Rudy. Come on, here, taxi.
I think it's such a beautiful scene. If I don't actually cry, it almost makes me tear up every single time.
I think that's a special art to that, right? Where Lubitsch never makes you cry, but he's very good at making you almost tear up.
Yeah, and I think part of that is it could be construed as a very sad scene. But first off, there's no music to tell you how to feel. That makes the audience do a little bit more work. But also, the whole time, Moderchuk is going up from person to person, and he's asking them about their Christmas plans, and he's delivering it all with a smile. When he invites Kralik out to dinner, and Kralik says, look, I'd love to, but unfortunately I have an engagement. He just says, no, don't worry about it. I just wanted to make sure you had something to do on Christmas Eve, which is funny because Pepi is also already
Pepi is amazing.
Yeah, I have seen so many other comedies with an annoying teen character from this era. And every time I watch Pepi, I think to myself, why do I not hate him nearly as much as I hate so many of the other bombastic teen characters in other films? And what are your thoughts on him? Because he is amazing. He's awesome. And I love Pepi every time I watch this movie, but I don't know what separates him from the rest of the pack.
One, I just think that he's genuinely funny. Line by line, the actor playing him just knows how to pitch them. Lubitsch knows how to direct it so that they're actually funny on their own terms. So that's step one. But step two, to me, is how he responds. He's the last character you would want to be there when Mr. Moderchuk tries to shoot himself. And yes, at that moment, he takes the situation completely seriously. He doesn't treat it with any distance. He's just worried for his boss and tries to rescue him. And rushing into a guy holding a gun is, when you think about it, one of the bravest things anyone does in this whole movie. So when the chips are down, Pepi is there for you. Unlike all the other characters, we get to see him being his best self. Immediately after that, he reverts to being his own future capitalist ladder climber self. But now that we have seen beyond that, suddenly we have a lot more patience for him. In the second half of the film, when he's ragging on the doctor, or the pill pusher, when he's gloating over the fact that he's the new clerk, and I love Pirovich's line, who has done this terrible thing?
What's the matter? Didn't you ever see a clerk in your life before?
Who made you a clerk?
Yes, who did this dreadful thing?
Felix Bressart delivers that so quietly and soft-spoken. It's hilarious.
Yeah, I love how it's just completely sincere. His
seems genuinely hurt.
Yeah, he's just worried about the future, And yet, throughout all that, I'm always just thinking of, at heart, he is a good person who has a humanity underneath his facade. And like every single character in this film, he's a perfectly balanced mix of the elements that one could judge and other elements that come to the surface when circumstances allow us to go, you know what, you're a good person and we're saving.
That's a great point. Every character in this film gets a chance for us to really see who they are when the mask of comedy or comic relief sort of falls away. Like Pirovich at first he's not bumbling, but he is definitely portrayed as a little bit more simple when really he's just a happy man who is there for his friends and loves his family and everything. Really one of the most touching performances.
Brissart to me is one of the key performers in the Lubitsch canon. The three performances that he gives in the three films he's in, this, Nadashka, and To Be or Not to Be, I think are among my favorite performances in film history. In this, it feels like he's the character that Lubitsch understands, has it figured out. He has his priorities in life. He's a happy person. He's a genuine person. And he's not just one-dimensional. He's not happy because he has a happy family. He's happy because he's there for his friend. He also has his happy family. He's pragmatic. He knows to run to the phone to call off the doctor so as not to waste his money. He knows that having a contentious relationship with your in-laws is the way of things. He knows not to rock the boat at work so that he doesn't endanger his family, and he's okay with that.
Exactly.
The line that I love the most of his is a very small one where Kralik says, "Do you ever get a bonus?"
Perovich, did you ever get a bonus?
Yes, once.
Once. He says it was such yearning and nostalgia, as if that was his firstborn child or something. And yet his character on some level is also, he's a skinflint. He's cheap. So depending on how one looks at him, he could be this heady figure. But in the way Lubitsch portrays him, he's just about the most admirable character morally in this movie, which is very different from the morality in other Lubitsch films, where Trouble in Paradise just is one example. I mean, the moral code of that film is to be good is to be good at the thing you do. So in this case, Monescu is the hero, or a hero, but he's probably the most heroic character in the film. He is not only that, but he is a better version of the bumbling upper class people because he knows how to do it better because he got there honestly. He's a self-made crook. And that could not be more different than the morality in this film, which is that someone who just understands what it means to live a good life.
There is a sense of honesty in Perovich's character because it's not a film that's just saying everyone just needs to stay in their place. But Perovich knows his position. And like you said, he's very careful about it. He's learned to be happy with what he has. And I guess this ties back into the benevolence thing, where people are finding happiness and joy wherever they can in what their situation is. It's about finding joy in the smaller things in life, in the smaller instances, the characters that you're around rather than, people you wish you could be, which I think might be very close to home for Lubitsch. So much of his life was about striving to be a witty, cultural, upper class raconteur, boulevardier that so many of his films focus on. And in this film, he's learning about the humanity of people who just live a day-to-day life in any old shop you can think of.
Let's talk about Jimmy Stewart for a second in Kralik.
Oh, absolutely.
I've woefully neglected Jimmy Stewart up to this point. I'm going to lay my cards on the table. He's my favorite actor in history.
I actually think the same thing. If you ask me to name my number one favorite actor, at least male performer, it'd be Jimmy Stewart.
One would not necessarily think him a perfect fit for Lubitsch, right? I mean, Lubitsch, the Continental, but Jimmy Stewart understands the assignment so well here. His Kralik is this character who is defined by the gap between the man he wants to be and the man he is. It's not that he thinks himself a frustrated upperclassman. It's that he has this desire to better himself. He wants to buy that encyclopedia. But instead, he starts a correspondence on cultural subjects, which is all you can do in a letter. Every time I watch this film, I'm amazed by the way Stewart shades this. For every moment when your heart melts at how empathetic his character can be and how Jimmy Stewart plays that, there's a little scene like the one, I just love the bit. This time I noticed that Clara has taken ill due to psychological problems. He hands her the letter from her dear friend that he actually wrote, of course. And as she opens it and reads it, he gets this maniacal glint in his eye as he kind of catches a glance at her. And it's just equal parts excitement and slight sadism at the game he's playing, or his brutishness with Vardash after Marchek has said, don't do this, and cut to him doing the thing Marchek asked him not to do, making a huge scene out of Vardash's firing out of revenge. And at that moment, he's a scary guy. It feels like one more step and he's about to get violent. And the fact that that all coexists in this performance of a character who adds up to just this absolutely empathetic figure is incredible to me.
In terms of the altruism and wanting to be a better person, it's not even the pushing of Vada straight out of the shop and making a scene of it. It even goes down to the smallest sadism that no one else in the shop would even notice, where he says, Badish, I want you to go to the back and move all the black box bags from the bottom of the shelf to the top of the shelf and all the brown bags from the top of the shelf to the bottom of the shelf. And there's no need for him to do that. No one else is noticing. It's just his own small little petty revenge.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think it's interesting. You mentioned about the kind of person that he does strive to be. And obviously his letters are full of these quotes and passages and everything in poems. But whether it's him writing a little poem in Mrs. Matichek's book when he goes to dinner at the Matichek's home early in the film, or the actual letters he writes to Clara, he is always undercutting his own intelligence. Because in so many of those things, he could just say, that was my brilliant wit. He could have the confidence of the writer character in Design for Living. He could be like Frederick March and just believe fully in his own brilliance. But he's always saying, well, that's Victor Hugo, you know?
He stole that.
Which is so funny because in the whole scene at the end, he's breaking down what a not great guy the supposed pen pal is.
Mr. Popkin?
Mr. Popkin. Lubitsch has such a great way with funny names, and Matthias Popkin is one of my favorites.
Yeah. Seems like a spiritual sibling to the Merry Widows, Ambassador Popov.
Him saying, like, that's Victor Hugo, he stole that, is so funny because out of all the things he's saying, Matthias Popkin, oh, he has a bit of a belly. Oh, he's out of a job right now. Oh, he doesn't have a lot of hair. Out of all the things he's saying, the fact that he plagiarized Victor Hugo in a love letter, that's still going to be true when she finds out that it was Kralik the whole time.
Exactly. It's him laundering his own shortcomings in a very fun way. In a funny way, though, I don't think that cheapens his feelings, right? You can read that as him almost finding his way to being open with her. It is interesting to think about how if she had just approached him at that cafe halfway through the film and gone, I'm the dear friend, I think it's likely. It makes dramatic sense. Or to use the parlance of our times, it'll make sense dramaturgically for her to just reject him. Because that's suddenly, oh, what? You're here? Okay, bye. But because he constructs this elaborate dance of which the turning off the lights, leading her around the store, even the dolly movement seems to be part of this dance. He constructs this elaborate dance to lead her into taking him seriously. One thing I did notice, and I think your notes actually helped me see this, you know how he tries to dissuade her from getting the music box and instead getting her a wallet. And then he recruits Pirovich to make the exact same argument. I love that this is a reflection of their pen pal relationship because she will not take what he says. She will listen, but she will not accept anything he says because he is Kralik. In the same way that the only way that they can fall in love is through a proxy, the only way that he can get his wish of getting a wallet is through a proxy too. That final dance is him finally going, hey, we don't need this anymore. Here's my way of finagling you into accepting me for who I am, and this will also help me accept you for who you are.
Clara, what, Miss Novak of the shop yet?
No, Kralik, you must admit Clara's a very good-looking girl, and personally, I always found her a very likable girl.
Yeah, well, this is a fine time to talk about Miss Novak now.
Well, if you don't like Miss Novak, I can tell you right now you won't like that girl.
Why?
Because it is Miss Novak.
The length of time Jimmy Stewart pauses while processing his reaction to Pirovich saying, well, it is Miss Novak, is such a great example of Lubitsch's sense of rhythm. I mean, I would bet money that the length of that pause was micromanaged to death by Lubitsch. And it is 5 times as long as I think almost anyone would direct an actor to do that. It is so absurdly long, the time it takes Kralik to react. And they don't cut to a close-up or anything. It's just done entirely in a master shot. And then the shot continues, right? Kralik wipes frame and looks through the window. And I don't know, it's just the restraint there is incredible to me.
Absolutely. And the funny thing is, during that long silence and Kralik's reaction, there's not even a word of dialogue. Kralik doesn't even have the next line. He pauses. He has that long pause. He walks over to the window and looks at it. And then he sort of looks down, a little downtrodden. He crumples up the note that he was going to give her, throws it on the ground. And then Pirovich has the next line where he says, well, you're just going to make that poor girl wait? During that whole silent period, after that, Kralik doesn't even have the next line. He doesn't even verbally react to it at all. God, it's one of those moments that just makes me wish we had footage of Lubitsch actually acting out the scenes for his actors.
Jimmy Stewart, I mean, his body language in this film is unlike anything else he's ever done. He keeps his cadence. He doesn't do the thing that a lot of actors do, which is you can hear the Lubitsch cadence in a lot of performances. Jack Benny's my go-to, where he sounds like Lubitsch in To Be or Not to Be. His cadence is very similar to Lubitsch's speaking voice. It's all over. I mean, you can hear it in Gary Cooper, you can hear it in Miriam Hopkins, you can hear it in Claudette Colbert, everyone. But Jimmy Stewart, he really retains his usual speaking rhythms, but the way he moves is subtly different than it is in, for example, Philadelphia Story.
Absolutely. Because we were just talking about Jimmy Stewart, and I have to plug, if you haven't seen it, The Mortal Storm from the same year.
I was actually considering including it in the podcast because that's the Frank Borzage film. He's paired with Sullivan again, and it's this incredibly harrowing tale of the rise of Nazism.
Yeah, Frank Morgan, too. Frank Morgan is the father, the patriarch of the family. And the exact same year as Shop Around the Corner. Just unbelievable film. I happened to be in LA for like the UCLA Film and TV Archive Festival of Preservation one year. And that year they were playing The Mortal Storm. And I had seen it already, but the only DVD that's ever been released of it was Warner Archive DVD-R. And I saw it with a crowd. Like there was a crowd there to see that film. And not many people had seen the film before. And you could feel the air come out of the room as the movie goes on. And you realize just how dark it's going to get. There's so many connections to the Shop Around the Corner in the film, just because, you know, it's Eastern European setting. It's about a way of life that's sort of faded. The only difference is that the Mortal Storm actually directly attacks the thing that made this world disappear. And in the Shop Around the Corner, there isn't really a sense that the world's going to disappear. But if you watch the Shop Around the Corner in 1940, you would know what's going on in Budapest, in Hungary, in Eastern Europe at that moment.
There's like a historical dramatic irony too, because at that point, the Nazis had not invaded Hungary when this film was made or released. And then, you know, later in the war, they invade in Hungary. And then the Hungarian Holocaust is one of the most brutal genocides in history. It was actually the peak of Nazi Germany's mass murder was the Hungarian Holocaust, where they shipped everyone to Auschwitz. And so I'm always thinking when I watch this film of, oh God, knowing what we know now, none of these characters are going to survive the next 5 years.
Yeah. I mean, it's dark. There is another war connection, which makes me wonder, with everything going on in Eastern Europe and the fact that Lubitsch would never return to Germany and didn't even want to talk about it throughout the rest of his home life, it makes me wonder if him returning to a shop that's similar to the tailor shop he grew up in and surrounding himself with normal middle-class people that he grew up with, if this film is almost like him evoking some kind of nostalgia for his home that has been completely ruined. And you don't see that in the text, but knowing what we know about Lubitsch and his life and what was going on in the world at that time, it just adds another layer of power to what on the surface feels like a very light and easy to digest film.
I'm stealing a thought wholesale from David Callett's commentary in To Be or Not to Be here, but I think it's worth noting that despite being built on different studio lots, no commonality. The sets for Budapest in this film and the sets for Warsaw in To Be or Not to Be look strikingly similar. David Callett phrases it as the Nazis aren't just invading Warsaw, they're invading the shop around the corner. That's part of what makes the film feel like such a violation, To Be or Not to Be.
That's a good line. That's a really good line.
Yeah, I wish I'd said it.
I was going to say there was one thing about the shop around the corner itself I did want to bring up and talk about, and I was curious, but it's a dark moment, so I didn't want to end on this. Is it just me, or is the moment where Matichek tries to commit suicide, is that the darkest Lubitsch door moment in his entire filmography?
Oh, it must be.
It's using doors very much in the same way, where someone goes behind a door and we have to infer what's going on behind it. But it's a moment of complete despair. And every time I watch the film, I think about how daring the construction of that scene is, where Matichek goes into his office and shuts the door, and we know he's just received the most devastating news of his life. And then Pepi walks in the front door, and there's a little gag moment where he's talking on the phone with Mrs. Matichek, pretending to be one of the women who works in the shop. Then he blows her off and walks towards the back, wondering where everybody is. He opens the door to Matichek's office, yells out, "Mr. Matichek, don't do it," runs into the room.
Mr. Matichek! Don't do that, Mr. Matichek!
And this is a movie that is not showy in its camera work at all, but this is like the most obvious showiness where instead of cutting into the room, he just turns the camera and focuses on the light bulb hanging from Matichek's ceiling. And you hear them struggle. Matichek's telling Pepi to go away. A gunshot goes out, shoots the light bulb out. And even then, he still doesn't cut into the room yet. Pepi runs out, puts the gun outside of Matichek's office, and then we finally get the confirmation that Mr. Matichek is okay. And he missed.
That cut to the inside of the office is always interesting to me because it's not a dramatic cut. It's an undercut where it cuts to a very prosaic medium shot of Matichek. He's not in the corner, lit in a stark way. He's just standing in the middle of the room thinking about what he's done.
That's a great point.
It's a disarming way of doing it. It almost feels like the rhythm of the cut and that is designed to deflate the situation.
The thing is, there's not very many showy camera moves in the film or stuff like Trouble in Paradise where you see the shadows on the bed and everything. There's nothing really like that in the film, but his compositions just carry so much power in this film. I'm thinking of the scene where you see Clara sitting in the diner and Kralik walks by and peeks his head over the window, or even just in that same diner where there's no better shot to define the haters become lovers trope in romantic comedy than the shot of their two chairs back to back and them sitting back to back with each other. Or even in sadder moments, the composition where the four employees of Matichek and Company are standing looking at the door with their backs turned to the camera as Kralik leaves.
At this point, Lubitsch had fully transitioned from being a profoundly showy filmmaker. He was not afraid to let you know about his presence in films like The Merry Widow, especially. That's probably the apex of him letting you know he's there. In this film, his authorial presence is so soft-spoken, but incredibly well tailored to whatever he's doing.
There is one great moment that I finally learned the meaning behind it when listening to your podcast. And that is Kralik, she's dunking. I knew the dunking joke in this film and I knew the dunking joke in Trouble in Paradise, but I never fully understood until I think sometime in season 1 of this podcast, you guys discussed the history of dunking and how it's kind of a lower class thing. And I think this is probably the best dunking moment in Lubitsch's films where, you know, Kralik just responds with, well, why shouldn't she dunk?
It might be my favorite line in any Lubitsch film. It might be the one I used to intro this episode because when Firovich says Kralik, she is dunking, there's so much embedded in that. One, it's very, very funny. And his reaction to why shouldn't she dunk? You know, it's just the way even Felix Brizard moves his head is lovely. It says so much about his character, about Lubitsch, when you cross-reference it with, the dunking stuff in Angel, the dunking stuff in Trouble in Paradise. I've lost track of how many little dunking moments there are. I almost called the podcast Dunking with Lubitsch, which would have been a much worse title. But that line is so emblematic of the film where it's this combination of deep care on the part of Firovich with this very common instinct and slight elitism. Elitism for one, working class person for another. It's great.
Well, doesn't that just define Lubitsch entirely, where it's a line that's so simple and can be written off as a joke, but just tells you so much? And that is why I keep going back to him and his films over and over and over again.
Exactly.
Just saying she's dunking has so much meaning behind it.
The question of whether or not you dunk is one and the same as who you are in a Lubitsch film. Objects are identity. The way you deal with objects is your identity in these movies.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode, Kevin. This Shop Around the Corner Odyssey will be quite the journey.
Exactly. It's going to be a whole roadshow epic.
Exactly.
You know, with so many different points of view. I am absolutely honored, and this is one of my favorite films. I could continue talking about it for hours on end, and this has just been a real treat. So thank you so much.
Next week, Whit Stillman and Jose Arroyo join us to further discuss The Shop Around the Corner. Head over to ernstcast.com for information as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing this season and other resources such as show notes and our Discord server. How Would Lubitsch Do It is a production of Moving Image Agency. Willa Ross was our dialogue editor for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you happen to use. It helps other people find our podcast and therefore find Ernst Lubitsch. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was produced on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.